I'm posting here because I don't know how to untangle the mess my life has become. I think my wife might be manipulating me, but I'm starting to wonder if the cracks in my life started way earlier than her. Let me backtrack a bit and tell you about my childhood because, honestly, I think that's where everything started going wrong. I grew up in this small town no one ever leaves unless they're lucky or desperate. For as long as I can remember, I was the odd one out. I loved books, science experiments, and just learning things. But in a town where people mostly cared about sports, hunting, and working with their hands, that didn't exactly make me popular. I used to read in the school library during lunch while the other kids played basketball or hung out in the parking lot. I overheard the whispers. They thought I was weird, maybe even stuck up because I didn't try to fit in. My parents weren't any easier on me. My dad, John, was this old school, pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of guy. He believed in discipline above all else, which for him meant barking orders and never showing any softness. If I didn't meet his expectations, it wasn't a discussion. It was a lecture. My mom, Margaret, was there. That's the best way I can describe it. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't nurturing either. It felt like she was watching life from a distance, including mine. Then there were my siblings, Kevin and Sarah. Kevin was the golden boy, this all-star athlete who excelled at everything physical. Sarah, my older sister, was beautiful, charming, and popular. They were exactly the kind of kids my parents wanted. Kevin would come home with trophies, and my dad would practically burst with pride. Sarah had this magnetic personality and always seemed to have a line of friends, or admirers, waiting to see her. Meanwhile, I was just a dumb. Every time I brought home a perfect science project or a paper with an A+, it was like my parents barely noticed. "That's what you're supposed to do," Dad would say, as if excelling academically was just the bare minimum. Once, I built a working model of a wind turbine for a school competition. I was so proud of it. When I showed it to my dad, he just muttered, "Looks flimsy. Hope it doesn't fall apart." That night, I overheard him bragging about Kevin's latest game-winning goal to a neighbor. The worst part was that Kevin and Sarah knew they were the favorites. They weren't mean to me outright, but they never let me forget it either. Kevin would ruffle my hair like I was some pet he barely tolerated. Sarah, always poised, would throw little backhanded compliments my way. "You're so smart, Adam. Too bad people don't really care about that kind of stuff here." I started to believe something was fundamentally wrong with me. No matter how hard I worked or how much I achieved, it was never enough to make me feel valued. I wasn't Kevin, the athlete, or Sarah, the social butterfly. I was just the oddball who lived in his books and experiments. Looking back, I realized my childhood wasn't just difficult. It was shaping me into someone who felt like they had to fight for approval, for love. It's not like I didn't try to break out of the mold. I wanted so badly to be seen. I tried joining the school soccer team once, thinking maybe if I could be a little more like Kevin, things would change. I lasted 2 weeks before I quit. I was awful at it and I hated every second. It was around then that I decided to just double down on what I loved. Science and books became my escape. I told myself I didn't need their approval, that I'd find my own way. But deep down, I never stopped craving it. Now that I'm married, I can't help but wonder how much of that shaped the choices I've made. My wife, Emily, is beautiful, confident, and, at first, made me feel like I was finally enough for someone. But lately, things have been off. I don't know if I've been blind to it or if I'm just conditioned to brush off the signs. It's like I can still hear my dad's voice in the back of my head, telling me I'm imagining things, that I'm overthinking it. Anyway, I'll get into what's been happening with Emily soon, but I wanted to give some background first. I feel like my whole life has been one long pattern of feeling small and unseen. Maybe this is just more of the same, or maybe it's something I finally need to face. I wasn't completely alone growing up. There was one person who made me feel like I wasn't a total outcast. Nick. I met Nick when I was 10. He was new in town, and from the moment he showed up in class, he didn't seem to care about fitting in. He had this sharp wit and a way of handling people with his words that I could only dream of. While I shrank from the teasing and tried to blend into the background, Nick had this way of deflecting it like it was nothing. If someone tried to pick on him, He'd fire back with a joke so quick and clever that they'd be laughing before they even realized they were the butt of it. Nick didn't care that I was a bookworm or that I couldn't throw a football to save my life. He actually thought it was cool that I spent my weekends building little contraptions in my garage or reading about black holes. He'd hang out with me while I tinkered, asking questions like he genuinely cared about what I was doing. For the first time, I felt like someone actually saw me for who I was and didn't expect me to change. We were inseparable for 2 years. We'd spend hours riding bikes around town, talking about everything from space to the future. He'd tell me about his dream of becoming a writer someday. "Words are like weapons," he'd say. "If you know how to use them, you don't need anything else." I admired him so much. He made me feel brave in a way I never had before. It wasn't just the big things, either. Nick had this way of stepping in when I needed it most. Like the time a couple of boys from school cornered me behind the cafeteria, making fun of my glasses and calling me names. I was frozen, trying to figure out if I should just take it or run, when Nick showed up out of nowhere. "Wow, real original guys," he said, leaning casually against the wall like he didn't have a care in the world. "What's next? Are you gonna make fun of his shoes? Maybe call him a nerd?" "Oh wait, you already did that." "Bravo." The boys looked at each other, confused, and before they could come up with a response, Nick added, "Seriously, if you're gonna bully someone, at least be creative about it. This is just embarrassing for all of us." They slinked away after that, grumbling something under their breath, but I didn't care. Nick had my back. I don't think I ever told him how much that moment meant to me, how much he meant to me, and then one day he was gone. It was so sudden. We were 12, and we just finished a week of planning out some ridiculous science fiction story we were going to write together. Then, on a Monday morning, he didn't show up at school. I called his house after school, but the number was disconnected. I rode my bike to his place, but when I got there, the windows were dark, and a for sale sign was planted in the front yard. No one really knew what happened. Some kids said his dad got a job in another state, and they left in a hurry. Others said his family was in some kind of trouble. Whatever the reason, Nick disappeared from my life just as suddenly as he'd entered it. I tried to keep going, but without him, it felt like the little bit of light I'd found was gone. I still had my books and my experiments, but it wasn't the same. There was no one to share them with anymore. Even now, years later, I think about Nick sometimes. I wonder where he is, what he's doing. I wonder if he became a writer like he always said he would. But mostly, I wonder if he ever thinks about me. If he remembers the kid he left behind in that small town, holding on to the memory of a friendship that had been the only real connection he'd ever known. Nick made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just some background character in everyone else's story. And when he left, it was like I'd lost not just a friend, but a piece of myself. When I got into university, I thought it would be my chance to start fresh. I could leave behind the small-town stigma and be whoever I wanted to be. But instead of thriving, I ended up isolating myself even more. It wasn't that I didn't want to make friends, I just didn't know how. I'd been so used to being the odd one out that I didn't trust anyone to genuinely like me for who I was. I went to classes, did my work, and spent most of my free time in my tiny dorm room. My books and projects were still my refuge, but it was lonely. One day, I came back from class to find a letter slipped under my door. It wasn't the usual junk mail or a flyer. It was addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I nearly dropped it on the floor. It was from Nick. I must have read it 3 times before it really sank in. He apologized for disappearing all those years ago, explaining that his family had to leave suddenly because of some financial and legal troubles. "I never forgot about you, Adam," he wrote. "I always hoped we'd cross paths again someday." He'd included a number at the bottom, asking me to call him. I hesitated at first. Part of me was scared it wouldn't be the same, that maybe the memory of our friendship was better left untouched. But curiosity got the better of me and I called. The moment I heard his voice, it was like no time had passed at all. Nick was still Nick, quick-witted, confident, and somehow able to make me feel at ease within minutes. We talked for hours, catching up on everything. He told me he was living in a different city, working odd jobs, but he wasn't exactly thriving. "I've got ideas, though," he said. "Big ones." A few weeks later, he pitched one of those ideas to me. "What if we started a business?" he asked. "Something that combines your brains and my charm." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he was dead serious. First, the idea was simple. We'd do homework for other students, just the small stuff. I wasn't sure about it, but Nick had a way of making it sound harmless. "We're not hurting anyone," he said. "They get their grades, we make a little cash, and everyone's happy." The demand was immediate. Word spread fast, and soon we weren't just doing homework. People started asking us to take online quizzes, write essays, and even sit in for exams. Nick handled the logistics, finding clients, negotiating prices, while I focused on the actual work. It wasn't long before we started charging serious money. At first, it was $50 for a small assignment, then $500 for major projects. When it came to exams, people were willing to pay over $3,000 for us to take them. I was shocked at how much people would shell out just to avoid doing the work themselves. The money rolled in faster than I could have imagined. We went from barely scraping by to pulling in tens of thousands of dollars a month. Couldn't believe it. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was good at something that actually mattered. But there was always this little voice in the back of my head, whispering that what we were doing wasn't right. Nick would brush it off anytime I brought it up. "Come on, Adam," he'd say. "The system's rigged anyway. We're just giving people a shortcut through the bullshit." It was hard to argue with him when I was looking at my bank account. Suddenly, I didn't have to worry about student loans or rent. I could afford things I'd never even dreamed of, and it felt good. For the first time, I wasn't struggling, and I wasn't invisible. Nick and I were closer than ever. It was like we'd picked up right where we left off, except now we were partners in this strange, lucrative venture. He kept me grounded in a way no one else could, always reminding me of my worth, even if the work we were doing was questionable. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the beginning of something darker. If reconnecting with Nick and diving into this business set the stage for everything that's happening in my life now. At the time, though, it felt like I'd finally found my place in the world, even if it wasn't exactly legal or ethical. I told myself it was just temporary, that we'd ride the wave for a little while and then move on to something else. But deep down, I think I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The business grew bigger, and with it, so did the risks. First, everything seemed under control. Nick was a master at keeping things discreet. Vetting clients, setting up secure ways to exchange payments, and making sure we left no obvious trail. But as the money rolled in, the stakes got higher. I think we both started to feel invincible, like nothing could touch us. That illusion shattered 2 years later. It started with an email. The subject line was, "We need to talk." The message was short and to the point. "I know what you and your friend have been doing. If you don't want this to come out, you'll pay me $50,000. Instructions to follow." I froze when I read it. My first instinct was to think it was a prank. But when I showed it to Nick, his face darkened. "This isn't a joke," he said. "Someone's got dirt on us." The message didn't say who it was, but whoever it was, they knew enough to make us panic. They attached screenshots, emails between Nick and some clients, payments we'd sent back and forth. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to ruin us. Nick wanted to call their bluff, but I was too scared. "What if they go to the police?" I asked. "Or the university? We can't risk it." Reluctantly, he agreed to pay. We wired $50,000 to the account they provided and hoped it would end there. Didn't. A week later, we got another email. This time, they wanted $100,000. Then $150,000. No matter how much we paid, the demands kept coming. It was like they knew exactly how much we could afford and were determined to bleed us dry. Nick and I started to fight. He wanted to track the blackmailer down and deal with them directly. I didn't even want to think about what he meant by that. "We can't just keep giving them money," he shouted during one of our arguments. "They're never gonna stop." But I didn't see another way out. By the time we'd paid them over $250,000, I felt like I was drowning. The stress was unbearable. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt like my heart was going to explode. Then, out of nowhere, the emails stopped. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. Maybe the blackmailer had decided they'd milked us for all we were worth and moved on. But the silence didn't bring relief, it brought dread. Something didn't feel right. A month later, my worst fears came true. Nick and I had flown to Singapore, thinking it was safer to get out of the country while we figured out what to do next. We were staying in this high-end apartment Nick had rented, pretending everything was fine. When the police showed up, they stormed in like a scene from a movie, guns drawn, shouting orders. I remember being handcuffed, shoved into the back of a car, and thinking, this can't be happening. This isn't real. It was real. The charges were extensive. Fraud, bribery, academic misconduct. Apparently, the blackmailer had gone to the authorities after all, and handed over everything they had on us. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, emails, even recordings of conversations Nick and I had with clients. The trial was quick, brutal. The judge didn't seem to care about our side of the story. Not that there was much to defend. We'd broken the law, plain and simple. Both Nick and I were sentenced to 7 years in prison. I'll never forget the look on Nick's face when the sentence was read. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. It was like he'd expected it all along. Me? I was a wreck. I couldn't stop shaking. 7 years felt like a lifetime. They sent us to separate prisons. I didn't even get to say goodbye to Nick. One day we were partners, best friends, and the next he was just gone. I don't know what happened to him after that. I spent the first few months of my sentence replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out where we'd gone wrong. Was it when we started the business? When we paid the first ransom? When we got greedy? Or was it just fate, waiting for the perfect moment to punish me for thinking I could finally be someone? 7 years is a long time to sit with those questions. A long time to think about how quickly everything can fall apart. When I was finally released, I was 29 years old, feeling like I'd aged a lifetime in those 7 years. Prison strips you down to nothing. Whatever identity I thought I had before, gone. I came out quieter, more cautious, like I was bracing for the world to hit me again. I didn't have many options, so I went back to my hometown, back to the house I grew up in. It was strange walking through that door again. Everything looked the same, the worn-out couch, the pictures on the walls, but it all felt hollow. My parents greeted me like they were doing me a favor by letting me come back. We never talked about the arrest, the trial, or the time I'd spent behind bars. I guess they thought ignoring it was the best way to deal with it. I didn't push. I was just grateful to have a roof over my head while I figured out what to do next. Then, a few weeks after I got home, I found out about Austin. Growing up, my parents never mentioned him. Apparently, they'd adopted Austin when I was a baby but sent him to live with relatives when he was 16. He was trouble, my dad said when I confronted him about it. We didn't want him to be a bad influence on you kids. At first, I thought maybe they'd done the right thing. If Austin was that much of a problem, maybe they'd been protecting us. But then I found out what really happened. Austin wasn't just some troublemaker. They'd sent him away after he stole my college fund. I couldn't believe it when I found out. My parents had set aside money for my education, or so I thought. Turns out, Austin got his hands on it first. He used it to pay off his own debts, then disappeared. My parents didn't even try to get it back. They didn't tell me because they thought it wouldn't make a difference. I was furious. All those years I'd struggled to scrape by in college, working part-time jobs and drowning in loans, and they'd let it happen. Worse, they acted like it wasn't a big deal. That money wasn't guaranteed to you, my dad said. You found your own way, didn't you? You didn't need it. I couldn't even look at them. I started making plans to leave, to get as far away from them as possible. But before I could, things got even worse. One night, my dad cornered me in the kitchen. He brought up the business Nick and I had run, asking how much money we'd made before it all fell apart. At first, I didn't want to answer, but he kept pressing. We know you had money, he said. A lot of it. And frankly, we think we're entitled to some of it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Entitled, I said, laughing bitterly. You've got to be kidding me. He wasn't. My mom joined in, saying they'd sacrificed so much to raise me and that I owed them for everything they'd done. You wouldn't even have the brains to start a business like that if it weren't for us, she said. I I told them the money was gone. Between the blackmail, legal fees, and losing everything in the trial, I didn't have a cent left. But they didn't believe me. They thought I was hiding it somewhere, that I'd stashed it away for when I got out. When I refused to give them anything, they threatened to sue me. At first, I thought they were bluffing. What kind of parents sue their own child? But they weren't bluffing. They filed a lawsuit against me, accusing me of stealing family ideas for the business and hiding money from them. They claimed they'd given me the initial concept and even lent me funds to get started, which was a complete lie. I felt like I was in a nightmare. My own parents were dragging me through court, trying to squeeze money out of me when I had nothing left to give. I didn't even know how to defend myself. The shame of it all was unbearable. They didn't win, but that didn't matter. The damage was done. The case got dismissed after a few months, but by then, I'd lost whatever shred of trust one still had in them. I moved out the same week, crashing on a friend's couch until I could find a place of my own. I haven't spoken to my parents since. Every time I think about them, all I feel is anger and betrayal. They were supposed to protect me, to be the one constant I could rely on no matter how bad things got. Instead, they turned on me the moment they thought there was something in it for them. Some days, I wonder if I'll ever be able to forgive them. Other days, I'm not sure I want to. After everything my parents put me through, I thought I was done with them. I wanted to walk away, leave it all behind, and never think about them again. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something I was missing. The lies about Austin, the lawsuit, their complete lack of remorse. It didn't add up. I decided to hire a private investigator. At first, I felt ridiculous. Who hires a PI to dig into their own family? But the deeper I dug into my own memories, the more I realized how little I truly understood about my parents and the things they kept hidden. I needed answers. The investigator, a sharp-talking woman named Karen, took the case with barely a raised eyebrow. "Family secrets are some of the worst ones," she said. "People will do anything to protect them." She wasn't wrong. Karen worked fast, and within a few weeks, she uncovered something that made my blood run cold. My parents hadn't just known about Austin's crimes, they'd helped him. It turned out Austin had been in trouble for years, even before he stole my college fund. He'd been caught embezzling money from one of his part-time jobs, and my parents had paid off his employer to keep it quiet. When that didn't work, they sent him to live with a relative out of state, thinking a change of scenery might straighten him out. But the most damning evidence came from bank records Karen dug up. Shortly before my college fund disappeared, there were large cash withdrawals from my parents' accounts, all deposited directly into Austin's. My parents hadn't just turned a blind eye, they'd actively funneled him the money. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. All those years of struggling, of scraping by, and they'd stood by and let Austin ruin everything. Worse, they'd covered it up, pretending it never happened, as if their silence could erase the damage. Karen urged me to take the evidence to the authorities. I hesitated. No matter how angry I was, these were still my parents. Turning them in felt like crossing a line I couldn't come back from. But then I thought about what they'd done, the lies, the lawsuit, the years of manipulation, and I realized they'd crossed that line first. The day I handed over the evidence was one of the hardest of my life. The authorities acted quickly, launching an investigation that revealed even more than I'd expected. My parents had been involved in several shady financial deals over the years, many of them tied to Austin. Together, they'd defrauded family members, friends, and even their church. When the arrests came, it was surreal. I watched the news footage of my parents being led out of their house in handcuffs, their faces blank with shock. Austin was arrested too, dragged out of some dingy motel where he'd been hiding. They were all charged with conspiracy, fraud, and a laundry list of other crimes. The trial was a media circus. Everyone wanted to know how a family could turn on one of their own, how parents could betray their child so completely. The public, which had once seen me as a disgraced fraudster, started to shift their opinion. Suddenly, I wasn't the villain. I was the victim of a family that had been rotten to the core. In the end, my parents and Austin were sentenced to long prison terms. The judge didn't hold back, calling their actions a betrayal of the most fundamental trust. I sat in the courtroom, listening to the verdicts, feeling equal parts vindicated and hollow. Even with the truth exposed, my reputation was still a mess. People were sympathetic, sure, but sympathy doesn't erase headlines. To many, I'd always be the guy who cheated his way through life, even if the full story was more complicated than that. I've spent the past few years trying to rebuild. It hasn't been easy, but I've learned to take it one day at a time. I've cut ties with most of my family, started therapy, and even made a few real friends. People who see me for who I am, not the headlines or the baggage. There are days when I still feel the weight of it all, when the anger and betrayal bubble up and threaten to consume me. But then I remind myself that I'm free now. Free from the lies, the manipulation, and the constant need to prove myself to people who never deserved it. Sometimes freedom comes at a price. Mine cost me a family, a reputation, and years of my life. But for the first time, I feel like I can finally start over. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. I never thought I'd see Nick again. After everything that happened with the business and prison, I assumed we'd gone our separate ways for good. But life has a funny way of circling back. I was 2 years out of prison, living paycheck to paycheck, trying to keep my head down and figure out what to do with my life. One day, out of nowhere, I got a call. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, there was no mistaking that voice. "Adam," Nick said, "we need to talk." It wasn't exactly a warm reunion. The last time I'd seen him, we were being dragged away in cuffs. But Nick being Nick, he cut straight to the point. He wanted to start a new business together. First, I thought he was crazy. After everything we'd been through, why would I even consider it? But then he told me his idea. A PR agency specializing in crisis management. "We know what it's like to have everything fall apart," he said. "Who better to help people put the pieces back together?" I was skeptical. Could we really turn our experience, most of it earned through bad decisions, into something legitimate? But the more Nick talked, the more it started to make sense. We'd both hit rock bottom, survived public humiliation, and come out the other side. If anyone knew how to navigate a scandal, it was us. We started small. At first, it was just the two of us, working out of a shared office space with borrowed furniture and a shoestring budget. Our first clients were local businesses, restaurants dealing with bad reviews, small companies struggling with PR disasters. Nick handled the charm and networking just like he always had. He was a natural, convincing people that we were exactly what they needed. I worked behind the scenes, crafting strategies, writing statements, and finding ways to turn bad press into redemption stories. It was slow going at first, but word spread. People started noticing how good we were at what we did. One client led to another, and before long, we weren't just fixing bad Yelp reviews, we were managing major corporate crises. CEOs facing public backlash, influencers caught in scandals, even politicians in hot water started calling us. The money came rolling in. We charged tens of thousands of dollars per client, sometimes more for high-profile cases. Within a few years, we'd built a reputation as one of the best crisis management firms in the business. Nick thrived in the spotlight, always schmoozing with clients and reporters, making sure our names stayed in the right circles. I preferred to stay behind the scenes, focusing on the work. I didn't mind letting Nick take the credit. It was better that way. What surprised me the most wasn't the success but the sense of purpose I felt. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove myself to anyone. I wasn't chasing approval or fighting to be seen. I was just doing something I was good at and it felt right. Nick and I talked about the irony of it all sometimes. How we'd gone from breaking rules to helping people clean up their messes. "Redemption's a hell of a business," he'd say with a grin. And he was right. Now we're handling international corporations, celebrities, and even government agencies. Our agency's name is well known in the field of crisis management, and we're earning millions. But it's not just about the money anymore. For me, it's about knowing I've finally found my footing. Even after everything I've been through, there are still moments when I think about the past, the mistakes, the betrayals, the years I lost. But I don't let those moments consume me anymore. I've built something real, something that matters, and I did it on my own terms. And this time, I know it's not going to fall apart. No matter how far we've come, the past always finds a way to creep back in. Even now, with the success Nick and I have built, it's clear we'll never fully escape it. First, everything felt like a fresh start. Our agency was thriving, and we were finally doing things the right way. After years of living in the shadows, cutting corners and making bad decisions, it felt good to stick to a strict code of ethics. No shortcuts, no gray areas. We promised ourselves we'd build something we could be proud of. But the higher you climb, the more enemies you make. Crisis management is a high-stakes game, and not everyone plays fair. We've had competitors try to sabotage us, spreading rumors or stealing clients. Once, a rival firm even tried to leak parts of my criminal record to discredit us. It was a harsh reminder that the skeletons in my closet aren't going anywhere. No matter how hard I work, there are always people ready to use my past against me. But if prison taught me anything, it's how to stand my ground. When that firm came for me, I didn't back down. We responded with transparency, owning my history while making it clear how far I'd come since then. It was a risk, but it worked. Still, the challenges aren't just external. The pressure of running a multi-million-dollar agency can weigh heavily, especially when you've spent most of your life feeling like you're one mistake away from losing everything. Nick handles it better than I do. He's always been the charismatic one, the optimist. But even he admits that the stakes can feel suffocating. We've also had to deal with the fallout of our work. Not every client we take on deserves a second chance, and there are times when the line between justice and damage control gets blurry. We've turned down cases that didn't sit right with us, even when the money was tempting. It hasn't been easy, but I'd rather walk away from a fortune than compromise the values we've worked so hard to rebuild. In a strange way, the struggles have brought Nick and me closer. We've been through hell together, and there's a bond in that that's hard to explain. We know each other's flaws, our limits, and the weight we both carry. He still teases me for overthinking everything, and I still roll my eyes at his tendency to charm his way out of trouble, but we've learned to balance each other out. As for me, I've learned how to fight, not with anger or desperation, but with purpose. Every obstacle I've faced, my family, prison, rebuilding my life, has taught me something. I've learned to stand up for myself, to hold my ground when the odds feel insurmountable, and to trust that I have the strength to get through whatever comes next. The success of our agency has given me something I never thought I'd have: stability. For the first time, I'm not constantly looking over my shoulder or wondering when the rug will be pulled out from under me. I've built a life that's mine, one that no one can take away. But I'm not naive enough to think the challenges are over. In this business, and in life, there's always another storm on the horizon. The difference now is that I'm ready for it. My past will always be a part of me, but it doesn't define me anymore. It's a scar, not a wound. And while I can't change where I've been, I can decide where I'm going. For the first time, that's a choice I feel strong enough to make.